Welcome to today's episode of the Thom Saria Podcast. In our last episode, we discussed the nature of petrol and how the United States gained immense financial control through oil trading, agreements settled in US dollars. This gave America the freedom to print as much money as it wanted, exporting inflation to other nations. But there's an issue we need to clarify. The power to print money doesn't actually belong to the US government. Back in 1913, under pressure from powerful financiers, then President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, giving way to the Federal Reserve. Not long after, he bitterly admitted, "I am the most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country." This great industrial nation had come under the control of its own credit system, placing economic growth and all national activity in the hands of a select few. What is the Fed, then? Although it's called the Federal Reserve, it's never been a government agency. It's an ultra-powerful private financial institution run by a handful of elite financiers. While the president appoints its chairman, this appointment is practically obligatory if the president wants to avoid assassination or impeachment. As has happened to some unfortunate leaders in the past, many people worldwide still believe that the right to issue dollars belongs to the US government, but in reality, it doesn't. Since President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, the Federal Reserve has created money out of thin air, backed by debt. This arrangement began with the Federal Reserve Act, also known as the Nelson Act, which Wilson signed just before Christmas in 1913. This act stripped the US government of any control over money printing. From that point on, for every dollar printed, American citizens owed the Fed that much. American history holds tragic chapters marked by racial divides and civil wars. But one of the most tragic events was the passing of the Nelson Act on December 23, 1913, by the 28th President, Thomas Woodrow Wilson. No other US president in history signed a bill so quickly just before Christmas, a decision Wilson himself later regretted. He felt he had no choice, as his political position had been secured 2 years before, in the 28th presidential election, due to powerful financiers who had polished and paved his political career. Prior presidents had attempted to reclaim the power to issue currency for the American people, but two of them, Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, met with assassination attempts. A third, President John F. Kennedy, suffered the same fate. The origins of the Nelson Act go back to the time between 1862 and 1913, when the US developed its central banking system under the National Bank Act. Various banking crises in 1873, 1893, and 1907 pointed to the need for a central bank to oversee the markets. President Theodore Roosevelt proposed a financial reform, appointing financiers to develop an economic and financial reform plan. After the banking panic of 1907, Congress created the National Monetary Commission to draft a reform plan. Nelson Aldrich, a Republican leader in Congress and a financial expert, was named chairman. Aldrich conducted extensive research on central banks across Europe, finding that Britain and Germany's central banks were far superior. By 1910, he sought help from America's leading banks, working with financial titans such as J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, and Kuhn, Loeb & Co., to develop a comprehensive plan to establish an advanced financial system for the United States. In a secret week-long meeting at Jekyll Island, these influential figures and other elites crafted the plan. But the most daunting presence was Paul Warburg, representing the Rothschild family in America. His alliances with the Rockefeller and Morgan dynasties predated Jekyll Island, enabling him to devise a structure that would secure financial power for private banking dynasties spanning across generations. Recognizing the law's far-reaching impacts, Senator Aldrich used his influence to gain President Wilson's backing, securing passage for the Nelson Act. Here are some crucial points about the Fed. Firstly, the Fed is a 100% privately owned bank The US government holds no shares in it. When the government overspends its tax revenue, it has to borrow money from the Fed, which prints more money to meet that demand. While Congress is supposed to have some oversight, the Fed's ability to issue currency is limited only by its reserves, which are ultimately US government debt. Secondly, the Fed is the sole entity allowed to print US dollars. Every dollar the Fed issues adds to America's debt burden. Thirdly, the Fed consists of 12 branches in different states, each functioning as a privately owned commercial bank, often referred to as Fed subsidiaries. These are based in cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, St. Louis, San Francisco, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and Dallas. The New York Fed holds 53% of the Federal Reserve shares. The Fed's central hub is in Washington, D.C., but New York handles global financial operations. Dividing the Fed into 12 branches aims to placate Southerners and Americans affected by recessions, giving the impression that no single organization monopolizes power. The Fed's structure includes a 7-member board of governors, comprising a chairman, the Treasury Secretary, and the controller of the currency as government representatives. Although the president nominates board members, they're limited to appointing 1 member per term, subject to Senate approval. However, the Federal Advisory Council significantly influences the board's decisions. This council, composed of members appointed by the heads of the 12 regional Feds, wields most decision-making power. This system diminishes the president's and government's influence over the Fed, and the US dollar's value can fluctuate accordingly. Meanwhile, this law ushered in income tax, making Americans liable to support government debt payments through their earnings. What we see is a facade. Though it appears government-owned, the US Federal Reserve is actually controlled by powerful private financiers, some with German Jewish heritage. The Fed structure sidesteps US law, stripping the government of any control over currency issuance. But US banknotes still carry the phrase, "In God we trust." Every dollar printed increases America's debt to the Fed. Moreover, this power is hidden behind a system meant to appease the public and Southern financial interests. While globally controlling politics and economics, it undermines the ideals of the nation's founders. Dating back to the original 13 colonies, the Nelson Act allows the Fed to alter the dollar's value and lets commercial banks pump or retract money from the economy to inflate or deflate economic bubbles. Fed interest rate adjustments directly impact the global economy, with the world watching their decisions closely. Globally, there are 2 kinds of money: borrowed money and non-borrowed money. Borrowed money is the fiat currency circulating today, primarily comprising government-backed debt. Non-borrowed money, like gold or silver, historically backed borrowed money. US history has seen government-issued currency with real backing. Notably, the greenbacks issued during Lincoln's presidency, but after Lincoln's assassination, greenback issuance was limited to $346,681,000, a fraction of the circulating US dollar supply. On November 22, 1963, when Kennedy, who fought for dollar control, was assassinated, non-borrowed currency gradually disappeared. The Fed severed the final link between gold and the dollar in 1971, leaving the US dollar as pure fiat currency. Since then, every dollar produced is an unsecured IOU backed only by US citizens' debt. Dollar creation, fundamental to economic measurement, depends on the Fed's reserves, which are public debt, meaning the Fed generates currency through government debt. The Fed, therefore, creates value through borrowed money alone. When President Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard in 1971, it meant that every dollar created was essentially backed only by the word of the US government. This led to an era where the US could print money without worrying about gold reserves, ushering in an age of fiat currency fully based on trust and debt. This shift transformed global markets, making the dollar a more volatile currency. Yet it also strengthened America's financial influence worldwide. Since other nations hold massive amounts of US dollars in their reserves, any fluctuation in the dollar's value has immediate and far-reaching impacts on the global economy. The Federal Reserve's policies affect not only the United States, but virtually every country. As the dollar is the world's primary reserve currency, over time, the ability of the Fed to control interest rates has proven to be one of its most powerful tools. By adjusting the rate at which it lends to banks, the Fed can control how much money is circulating within the economy. In periods of high inflation, the Fed raises interest rates to reduce the amount of borrowing and spending. During economic downturns, it cuts rates to encourage growth and job creation. However, this mechanism has its critics. Some argue that the Fed's rate policies artificially inflate or deflate economic bubbles, which can lead to crises like the 2008 financial meltdown. In that crisis, many believed that the Fed's low interest rates contributed to a housing market bubble, which eventually burst, causing a global recession. The Fed's influence extends beyond just controlling money supply and interest rates. It also serves as the lender of last resort. This role was vividly displayed during the 2008 financial crisis, when the Fed intervened to prevent major banks and financial institutions from collapsing. Through a series of bailouts, the Fed provided emergency loans and purchased assets to stabilize the economy. Critics, however, argued that this bailout mainly served the interests of Wall Street and the elite class, sparking the rise of movements like Occupy Wall Street, which protested against wealth inequality and the power concentrated within the hands of a few. While the Fed's decisions are sometimes portrayed as purely economic, they have immense political ramifications as well. The Fed's independence from the government means that elected officials have limited say over monetary policy. This has led to tensions between the Fed and several US presidents who disagreed with its policies. One notable example is President Donald Trump, who frequently criticized the Fed for not lowering interest rates quickly enough to stimulate economic growth. Presidents have historically walked a fine line with the Fed, recognizing its power, aware of their limited ability to influence it directly. As we move forward in the 21st century, the Federal Reserve's role increasingly scrutinized as income inequality grows and financial crises appear with greater frequency. Some propose reforms to make the Fed more accountable to the public and less beholden to private financial interests. Proposals range from requiring greater transparency in the Fed's decision-making processes to even questioning its private ownership structure. Many Americans remain unaware of the true nature of the Fed and the influence it wields over their everyday lives. Others question whether a private institution should hold so much power over the nation's economic destiny. The Fed's defenders argue that its independence is essential for maintaining a stable economy. They claim that political interference would undermine the Fed's ability to make difficult but necessary decisions, like raising interest rates to curb inflation. Even if such actions are unpopular, proponents say that a privately managed central bank, free from political pressures, is best suited to handle the complex demands of the modern economy. However, the secrecy surrounding the Fed's operations and its alignment with powerful private interests make it difficult for the average American to trust its motives. In the end, the Federal Reserve remains an enigmatic institution. It operates behind closed doors, making decisions that affect not only the American economy, but also the livelihoods of billions of people worldwide. Understanding who truly controls the Fed and the extent of its power is essential for those who want to comprehend the full picture of America's economic system.